I found the photograph at an antique shop in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a humid afternoon in late September, the kind where the air feels thick enough to drink, and Spanish moss hangs motionless from the live oaks. The shop was tucked into a narrow building on Meeting Street, one of those places that smells of old paper and furniture polish, where estate liquidations and attic cleanouts pile up in corners waiting to be discovered. The photograph was in a leather portfolio at the bottom of a box marked Miscellaneous Documents, 1800s. It was a large sepia-toned image, perhaps 14 by 18 inches, mounted on thick cardboard backing. The photographer's mark in the corner read, J. Morrison, photographer, Charleston, SC, but no date was visible. The image showed 3 figures in a composition so perfectly symmetrical it looked almost staged, almost unnatural. An elderly black man with a magnificent grey beard sat in an ornate chair at the center, his bearing regal and commanding. On either side of him stood 2 women who appeared to mirror each other with eerie precision. All 3 held their hands in front of their chests in an identical gesture, fingers interlocked to form a triangular shape, thumbs meeting at the apex, the rest of the fingers woven together below. The man sat like a patriarch or preacher, his gaze steady and direct, as if challenging the camera to judge him. The women wore identical dark dresses with white lace collars, their hair styled in the same fashion, their expressions calm but strangely vacant, as if something essential had been removed from behind their eyes. They stood in perfect mirror positions, their hands making that same triangular gesture, their postures suggesting not just obedience, but something deeper, something rehearsed, drilled, made automatic through repetition. On the back of the photograph, written in faded brown ink, were these words, Isaiah Carver and Daughters Charleston, South Carolina, August 1893. And below that, in different handwriting, more recent and written in pencil, they were never truly free. Look at their hands. I examined the hand gesture more closely under the shop's magnifying lamp. The triangular formation was deliberate and precise. Each person's fingers interlocked in exactly the same way, thumbs touching at the top to form the apex, the remaining fingers woven together to create the base of the triangle. It looked ceremonial, like a sign used in secret societies or religious orders, something loaded with meaning beyond the casual. But there was something else. When I looked very carefully at the photograph under strong magnification, I could see faint marks on the women's wrists, shadows that might have been scars, old injuries that had healed but left their evidence behind. The man's wrists showed no such marks, only the women. I bought the photograph for $20. The shop owner, an elderly white woman who seemed eager to clear out inventory, told me it had come from an estate sale in the old part of the city, from a house that had belonged to the same family since before the Civil War. She knew nothing else about it. Over the following months, I became obsessed with understanding what this photograph was really showing me. I started at the South Carolina Historical Society, searching through city directories, census records, and newspaper archives for any mention of Isaiah Carver. From the 1890 census, Isaiah Carver, black, male, age 55, occupation listed as preacher, residing at number 42 Calhoun Street. Household includes 2 daughters, names listed as Miriam and Deborah Carver, both age 23. From city directories, Reverend Isaiah Carver, minister of the African Covenant Church, meeting place listed as private residence, 42 Calhoun Street. born enslaved in 1835, freed at age 30 when the war ended in 1865. By the 1870s, he had become a preacher. By the 1880s, he had established his own small congregation. But when I searched newspaper archives, I found troubling reports that complicated this simple narrative of a man who had risen from bondage to become a spiritual leader. From the Charleston News and Courier, September 10th, 1893. Questions raised about private church neighbors in the Calhoun Street area have expressed concerns about the African Covenant Church, a small congregation led by Reverend Isaiah Carver that meets in his private residence. The church, which numbers no more than a dozen members, has become increasingly isolated from other Negro churches in the city. Former members describe Reverend Carver's teachings as unusual and his control over congregants as absolute. Of particular concern to some neighbors are Reverend Carver's two daughters, Miriam and Deborah, both aged 23. The young women who serve as church deaconesses have not been observed leaving their father's residence, except to attend church services, in more than 6 months. Neighbors report that the sisters appear thin and withdrawn, and that they keep their hands and forearms covered even in the warmest weather. Reverend Carver declined to speak with this newspaper, stating through an intermediary that his church's practices are matters of faith and not subject to outside scrutiny. From the Charleston News and Courier, September 25th, 1893. Police visit church following complaints. The Charleston Police Department conducted a welfare inquiry at the residence of Reverend Isaiah Carver, following multiple complaints from neighbors concerned about the welfare of his daughters. Officers found Miriam and Deborah Carver, both 23 years of age, residing in the home with their father. The women stated they were in good health and remained in the residence by their own choice, describing themselves as devoted to their father's ministry. Reverend Carver explained that his daughters have taken religious vows dedicating themselves to the church and to serving as examples of righteousness. As part of their spiritual discipline, they engage in regular fasting and prayer, which accounts for their appearance. The women displayed scarring on their wrists and forearms when questioned by officers. Reverend Carver stated these scars were remnants of a covenant ceremony performed when his daughters reached adulthood. He described the ceremony as a spiritual practice symbolizing their commitment to God's service. Officers found no evidence of current harm or criminal activity. The Carver sisters, being adult women of legal age, stated they chose to remain under their father's spiritual guidance. I found more troubling information in a report filed by a charitable organization that had attempted to intervene. Report of the Ladies' Benevolent Society of Charleston. October 1893. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, visiting agent. I have made 3 attempts to speak privately with Miss Miriam and Miss Deborah Carver, the adult daughters of Reverend Isaiah Carver, following reports of concerning conditions at their residence. My observations raise substantial alarm. The sisters appear severely underweight, with Miss Miriam particularly gaunt in appearance. Both women move slowly and speak in quiet, monotone voices. They refuse to show their arms or wrists, wearing long sleeves despite the heat. When pressed, they acknowledged scarring, but insisted these marks were voluntary symbols of their religious devotion. Neither woman appears capable of independent thought or expression. They speak in phrases that sound memorized, repeating their father's teachings word for word. When asked direct questions about their own wishes or desires, they defer immediately to Father's guidance, or God's will as Father interprets it. Both sisters describe a covenant ceremony performed when they turned 18 years of age. While they frame this ceremony as a willing spiritual commitment, details they let slip suggest something far more troubling. They mentioned being bound to the covenant for periods of purification, and one sister, Miss Miriam, inadvertently revealed that this binding was not merely symbolic. Most disturbing is their complete lack of awareness that their situation is abnormal. They have been so thoroughly conditioned to accept their father's absolute authority that they cannot conceive of any other form of existence. Former members of Reverend Carver's church, interviewed confidentially, describe a theology centered on absolute patriarchal authority. Reverend Carver preaches that he receives direct revelation from God, and that obedience to his word is obedience to God's word. He teaches that women must submit completely to male authority, particularly daughters to fathers, and that this submission mirrors the soul's submission to divine will. The covenant ceremony appears to have involved literal physical binding. Former church members report that Carver's daughters were subjected to extended periods during which their hands were bound together in a specific position, fingers interlocked in a triangular gesture that serves as the symbol of Carver's church. This binding could last for days, ostensibly to teach humility and acceptance of God's will through acceptance of physical constraint. I believe the Carver sisters are victims of severe psychological and physical abuse masked as religious practice. However, because both women are adults who insist their participation is voluntary, and because Reverend Carver frames all his practices as protected religious expression, I have found no legal avenue for intervention. I fear deeply for these women's safety, and believe their situation will worsen without outside help, that they are too conditioned to seek for themselves. I found the most detailed account in a memoir written decades later by a man named Thomas Wilson, who had been a member of Carver's church as a young man in the early 1890s. From A Life in Charleston, Memories of the Old City, by Thomas Wilson, published 1935. In the winter of 1892, when I was 19 years old, I attended services at Reverend Isaiah Carver's African Covenant Church. I remained a member for 8 months before my mother, God rest her, had the wisdom to remove me from that place. Reverend Carver was born into slavery on a rice plantation outside Charleston. He told us often about those years, about being property, about having no control over his own body or destiny. He had been freed at age 30, already a grown man who had spent his entire adult life in bondage. His theology grew from this experience, but in ways that twisted something that should have been liberating into something oppressive. He preached that submission was the path to salvation. Not submission to slavery, which he condemned, but submission to divine will, as interpreted through righteous authority, meaning himself. He taught that he had been chosen by God to lead the righteous through tribulation. He claimed to receive direct revelations, and he demanded absolute obedience from his congregation, but especially from his daughters, Miriam and Deborah. The twins had been born just after Reverend Carver established his church in the early 1870s. He raised them within his theology from birth, teaching them that daughters owed complete submission to their fathers as vessels of God's will, that women existed to serve and obey, that questioning authority was questioning God. When the twins turned 18 in 1888, Reverend Carver performed what he called the covenant ceremony. He described it to the congregation as a beautiful spiritual commitment, a voluntary dedication of his daughters to God's service. But those of us who attended the church witnessed what this ceremony actually entailed. The twins' hands were bound together in the church's symbolic gesture, fingers interlocked to form a triangle, thumbs meeting at the apex. Their wrists were then tied together with rope, keeping their hands locked in this position. They remained bound this way for 7 days. Reverend Carver called it a period of purification and submission, a way of teaching complete acceptance of God's will through acceptance of physical constraint. He said it mirrored the bondage he had endured in slavery, but with a spiritual purpose. Where slavery had been sin, this binding was sanctification. The twins were not permitted to eat during these 7 days, except for small amounts of bread and water. They were not permitted to sleep except while kneeling in prayer. Their hands remained bound in that triangular gesture the entire time, their wrists tied together with rope that left deep marks that would never fully heal. I watched Miriam and Deborah during those 7 days. I saw how their faces changed, how something behind their eyes went dim and then went out. They had been vibrant young women before the ceremony, full of life despite their father's strict control. After the 7 days, they moved like shadows, spoke in whispers, seemed to exist at a remove from the world. Reverend Carver repeated this binding ceremony periodically throughout the years that followed. Sometimes the twins would be bound for a day, sometimes for several days. He called it renewal of the covenant, or purification ritual. He said it kept them spiritually pure and reminded them of their dedication to service. But what I witnessed was not spiritual practice. It was control through pain and psychological conditioning. The binding left their wrists scarred. The fasting left them gaunt and weak. The isolation, they were forbidden from leaving the house except for church services, forbidden from speaking to anyone without their father present, left them unable to imagine any existence beyond his authority. The hand gesture visible in that photograph was the symbol of the church. Yes. We all made that gesture during services to show our submission to God's will. But for Miriam and Deborah, that gesture meant something else entirely. It was the position their hands had been forced into during binding ceremonies, the shape their fingers were locked into for days at a time, while rope cut into their wrists. When they made that gesture in the photograph, they were not simply showing devotion. They were documenting their bondage, showing the world what had been done to them, though I doubt most people who saw the image understood what they were really seeing. Reverend Carver controlled every aspect of his daughters' lives. What they ate, very little, as frequent fasting was part of their purification. When they slept, irregularly, as they were kept awake for extended prayer vigils. What they wore, always long sleeves to hide the scars on their wrists and arms. Whom they spoke to, no one outside the church without permission. Where they went, nowhere without his explicit approval. He justified all of this through Scripture and through his own experience of slavery. He said he understood bondage better than anyone, having lived as property. He said he knew the difference between sinful bondage and sacred submission. But watching what he did to Miriam and Deborah, I came to understand that he had learned slavery's lessons too well, not how to resist it, but how to impose it. My mother removed me from the church in the summer of 1893 after she heard Reverend Carver preach a sermon about how his daughters represented perfect righteousness through perfect submission. She told me later that she had recognized something in his words, some echo of the overseers and masters she remembered from her own years in slavery before the war. She said he spoke about control, the way white men had spoken about control, and she would not allow her son to learn those lessons. I never saw Miriam or Deborah again after leaving the church, but I heard, years later, about what became of them. I found the records of what Thomas Wilson had heard about. The Carver sisters' deaths were documented in Charleston's public records, though the newspaper coverage was minimal, just brief notices that said almost nothing about the circumstances. Death certificate, Miriam Carver. Date of death, November 3rd, 1894. Age, 24 years. Cause of death, heart failure, secondary to prolonged malnutrition. Additional notation, deceased showed extensive scarring on wrists and forearms, consistent with repeated binding. Father states scarring resulted from voluntary religious ceremonies. Deceased had been under father's care continuously and had not sought outside medical treatment. Death certificate, Deborah Carver. Date of death, April 17th, 1896. Age, 26 years. Cause of death, consumption, complicated by severe malnutrition. Additional notation, deceased showed scarring patterns identical to those of deceased sister. Father states deceased engaged in religious fasting and voluntary binding ceremonies as acts of spiritual devotion. Both sisters had died within 3 years of that photograph, being taken in August 1893. Miriam survived just over a year. Deborah lasted less than 3 years after her sister's death. I found one more document, a letter written by a doctor who had been called to examine Deborah Carver shortly before her death. March 1896. Dr. Robert Harrison, I was summoned to the residence of Reverend Isaiah Carver to attend to his daughter Deborah, who neighbors reported appeared gravely ill. What I discovered troubles me profoundly. Miss Carver, aged 26, weighed no more than 75 pounds. She was skeletal, barely able to stand, showing signs of advanced malnutrition. She had extensive scarring on her wrists, forearms, and ankles, marks consistent with repeated binding with rope or cord over an extended period. When I inquired about her condition, Miss Carver responded in a voice barely above a whisper that she was engaged in spiritual purification through fasting and prayer. She showed no recognition that her condition was life-threatening, no desire for medical intervention, no awareness that what had been done to her constituted harm. Her father was present throughout my examination and would not permit me to speak with his daughter privately. He explained that Miss Carver and her late sister had been dedicated to covenant service from childhood, that they had taken vows of absolute obedience and submission, and that their religious practices included regular fasting and periodic binding ceremonies meant to teach humility and acceptance of divine will. I attempted to explain that Miss Carver required immediate hospitalization and intensive nutrition, that her life was in imminent danger. Reverend Carver stated that earthly doctors could not understand spiritual matters, and that his daughter's condition was exactly as God intended it to be, a sign of her purity and dedication. I asked Miss Carver directly if she wished for medical treatment. She looked at her father before responding, then stated quietly that she submitted to her father's judgment in all things, as this was God's will. I left the residence deeply shaken, but legally unable to intervene. Miss Carver is an adult who insists her participation in these practices is voluntary. Her father frames everything as protected religious expression. Without evidence of a crime in progress, I have no authority to remove her from his custody against her stated wishes. But I do not believe Miss Carver's consent is meaningful. She has been conditioned from birth to accept her father's absolute authority, has been physically and psychologically controlled so completely that she cannot conceive of any alternative to his will. The binding ceremonies, the starvation framed as fasting, the complete isolation from any other influence, these are tools of control that have destroyed this woman's autonomy. Miss Carver's sister Miriam died last year under similar circumstances. I predict Deborah will not survive more than a few weeks. She is dying from malnutrition and from the psychological trauma of a lifetime of abuse disguised as religious devotion. What I witnessed in that house was slavery by another name. Reverend Carver was himself born enslaved, but he has recreated the dynamics of bondage in his relationship with his daughters. Absolute control, denial of autonomy, punishment for any resistance, conditioning so complete that the victims cannot recognize their own oppression. I have reported my concerns to the police, but they inform me that without criminal activity, they cannot act, and that adult women who claim to participate willingly in religious practices are beyond the reach of intervention. Deborah Carver died 6 weeks after this letter was written, in April of 1896. She was 26 years old. I had the photograph analyzed by a historian at the College of Charleston who specializes in post-emancipation African American history and the psychology of control and abuse. Analysis of the Carver family photograph, August 1893. Dr. Patricia Williams, Professor of History. This photograph documents one of the most troubling cases of post-slavery trauma and religious abuse in Charleston's history. It shows Reverend Isaiah Carver with his daughters Miriam and Deborah, approximately 1 year before Miriam's death and 3 years before Deborah's death. The composition is important. The perfect symmetry, the identical positioning of the daughters flanking their father, the matching gestures, the mirror image quality of their poses, suggests women who have been stripped of individual identity, reduced to matched reflections of each other, trained to move and behave in synchronized obedience. The hand gesture is central to understanding this image. The interlocked fingers forming a triangle served as the symbol of Carver's church, representing submission to divine authority. But for Miriam and Deborah, this gesture carried additional significance. It was the position their hands were forced into during covenant ceremonies, binding rituals during which their wrists were literally tied together for days at a time. When they made this gesture for the photograph, they were documenting their bondage. The image was intended to show spiritual devotion, but it actually shows control, conditioning, and abuse. Under magnification, scarring is visible on both daughters' wrists. This scarring is consistent with repeated binding with rope over an extended period. Reverend Carver's wrists show no such scarring. He imposed these binding ceremonies on his daughters, but did not subject himself to the same treatment. The historical context is essential. Isaiah Carver was born into slavery in 1835 and remained enslaved until age 30. He spent his entire youth and early adulthood as property, subject to absolute control by white masters. This experience shaped his theology in tragic ways. Rather than rejecting the dynamics of slavery, Carver internalized them and recreated them within his own family. He used religious authority the way slaveholders had used legal authority, to justify absolute control, to deny autonomy, to punish resistance, to condition complete submission. The binding ceremonies he performed on his daughters mirrored the physical restraint of slavery. Enslaved people had been chained, shackled, tied. Carver replicated this physical bondage, but reframed it as spiritual practice. The starvation he enforced through mandatory fasting mirrored the food deprivation used to control enslaved people. The isolation he imposed, forbidding his daughters from leaving the house or speaking to others, mirrored the separation and restriction of movement that characterized slavery. What makes this case particularly tragic is that Carver genuinely believed he was practicing righteousness. He had twisted his experience of oppression into a theology of control, convinced that submission and suffering were paths to salvation because these had been the conditions of his own life for 30 years. His daughters, raised within this theology from birth, could not recognize their oppression as oppression. They had been conditioned so thoroughly that even when legally free, even when technically able to leave, they could not conceive of existence outside their father's authority. This psychological bondage was as effective as physical chains, perhaps more so, because it convinced the victims that their bondage was freedom, that their abuse was love. This photograph serves multiple purposes. It documents a specific case of abuse. It illustrates how trauma can perpetuate itself across generations, with victims of oppression sometimes becoming oppressors in new contexts. It demonstrates how religious authority can be weaponized to justify cruelty. And it shows how psychological conditioning can be so complete that victims defend their own abuse and cannot be rescued even when rescue is offered. Both daughters visible in this photograph would be dead within 3 years, killed by starvation and psychological trauma inflicted by the man seated between them. The photograph is their memorial and their testimony, if we know how to read it correctly. Look at their hands. See the interlocked fingers, the precise triangular formation, the identical positioning. This was not a casual family gesture. This was the sign of their bondage, the position their hands were forced into during binding ceremonies, the symbol of their father's absolute control. They were never truly free. They were born after emancipation, legally free citizens, but they lived and died in bondage, not the legal slavery their father had endured, but psychological slavery that proved equally destructive. I donated the photograph and all related documents to the Avery Research Center for African American History and Culture in Charleston. The photograph is now part of an exhibition examining post-slavery trauma and the ways control and abuse can persist even after legal emancipation. The exhibition text reads, "The Carver Family Portrait, August 1893. This photograph shows Reverend Isaiah Carver with his daughters Miriam and Deborah Carver. Within 3 years of this photograph being taken, both daughters would be dead. Miriam at age 24 in 1894, Deborah at age 26 in 1896. Both died from malnutrition and medical neglect, resulting from their father's religious control. Reverend Carver was born enslaved in 1835 and freed at age 30 in 1865. His experience of slavery profoundly shaped his theology, but in tragic ways. Rather than rejecting the dynamics of control and submission he had experienced, he recreated them within his own family, using religious authority to justify absolute power over his daughters. Carver practiced covenant ceremonies, binding rituals during which his daughters' hands were tied together in a specific position for days at a time. He enforced severe fasting, disguised as spiritual purification. He isolated his daughters completely from outside influence, conditioning them from birth to accept his absolute authority as the will of God. The hand gesture visible in this photograph was the symbol of Carver's church, but it also documented his daughter's bondage. This triangular formation, fingers interlocked, was the position Miriam and Deborah's hands were forced into during binding ceremonies, the shape their wrists were tied into with rope that left permanent scars. This photograph is historically significant because it documents how trauma from slavery could perpetuate itself in new forms after emancipation. Carver had been enslaved, but he recreated slavery's psychological dynamics in his treatment of his daughters. It shows how religious authority can be used to mask abuse and make intervention impossible, even when victims are legally free adults. It demonstrates the limits of legal freedom when psychological bondage is complete. Miriam and Deborah Carver were free citizens under law, but they were never free in practice, having been conditioned from birth to accept their father's control as divinely ordained. It serves as a memorial to two women whose lives were consumed by abuse they could not recognize or escape, who died defending the system that killed them. When you look at this photograph, you are seeing three people making a hand gesture that appears ceremonial and religious. Look more closely. See the perfect symmetry of the daughters' positions, the vacant quality of their expressions, the scarring visible under magnification on their wrists. Understand what this gesture really meant for Miriam and Deborah. Not devotion, but documentation of the binding ceremonies that would eventually kill them both. They were never truly free. This photograph proves it. The photograph hangs in the exhibition now, behind protective glass, the three figures frozen in their symmetrical composition. Isaiah Carver seated at the center, commanding and stern, a man who had escaped physical slavery, only to recreate its psychological essence. Miriam and Deborah flanking him, perfect mirrors of each other, their expressions calm and empty, their hands making that triangular gesture that documented their bondage, even as it pretended to show devotion. Visitors often stop before this photograph for a long time. They study the hand gesture, note the identical positioning of the daughters, observe the strange vacancy in the women's eyes. Gradually, they understand what they are really seeing. Not a portrait of a devoted family, but documentation of control, conditioning, and abuse that killed two women before they reached age 30. It was just a portrait of a father and his daughters, until you look more closely at their hands, until you understand what that triangular gesture meant, both the symbol of submission to the church and the position their hands were forced into during literal binding ceremonies, until you see the scarring on their wrists, evidence of ropes tied tight, of hands held in that position for days at a time, of physical restraint disguised as spiritual practice. Until you learn that Miriam would be dead 14 months after this photograph, and Deborah would follow less than 3 years later, both killed by starvation and psychological trauma inflicted by the man whose absolute authority they had been conditioned from birth to accept as the will of God. Look at their hands. See the interlocked fingers forming that precise triangle. Note the identical positioning, the mechanical precision, the rehearsed quality of women who have been trained to move in perfect synchronization. And understand what this photograph really documents. Not devotion, but bondage, not freedom, but control, that proved as destructive as the legal slavery their father had endured decades before. Isaiah Carver, born into slavery in 1835, freed in 1865. He escaped physical bondage, but carried its psychological patterns with him, recreating them in his relationship with his daughters. He used religious authority to justify total control, used binding ceremonies to literally imprison Miriam and Deborah in their own father's house, used theological language to disguise abuse as sanctification. And in August of 1893, he had this photograph made, documenting his daughter's submission through that ritualistic hand gesture, creating a visual record that would outlast them both, that would serve as evidence and memorial long after they died from the control that photograph so perfectly captured. Miriam Carver, 1870 to 1894. Deborah Carver, 1870 to 1896. Two women born after emancipation, legally free citizens who lived and died in bondage nevertheless. Two women whose interlocked fingers in this photograph told the truth about what they endured, even as their calm expressions tried to hide it. This photograph is their testimony, not the testimony their father intended when he posed them in that symmetrical composition, hands making the gesture of his church. But the testimony we can read now in their interlocked fingers, in the scarring visible under magnification, in the vacant quality of their gazes, in the perfect mirror image positioning that showed how completely their individual identities had been erased. They were never truly free. They were bound by rope in ceremonies disguised as covenants. They were bound by starvation disguised as purification. They were bound by psychological conditioning so complete they could not imagine existence outside their father's will, could not recognize their oppression as oppression, could not escape even when doors stood unlocked. And this photograph documents that bondage. In the triangular gesture of their interlocked fingers, in the scars on their wrists, in the vacant obedience of their expressions, in the perfect symmetry that showed women reduced to reflections, stripped of individual will, trained to mirror each other in synchronized submission. This is what the photograph shows when you look closely at their hands. Not a symbol of devotion, but evidence of binding ceremonies. Not willing submission, but conditioned obedience. Not freedom, but slavery, that persisted after emancipation in psychological form, that killed two women who were legally free, but never truly liberated from the control that had shaped every day of their lives, from birth to death. Look at their hands. The interlocked fingers tell the truth. They were never truly free. And this photograph, taken in August of 1893, documents exactly how bondage persisted even after emancipation, not through legal slavery, but through religious authority, psychological conditioning, and physical abuse disguised as spiritual practice. It was just a portrait. Until you look at their hands and understand what those interlocked fingers really mean.